recently, we've seen a couple of very viral videos on social media. One in particular was an autistic boy who was forced to take a COVID test despite being exempt. So we'll discuss that shortly. But also a young girl in America was forced to take the vaccination, actually physically restrained and jabbed against her will. All of this and more with Liz Cole. Liz, thank you very much for dialing in. How are you today?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm not too bad, thanks. Just getting used to things. Let's start with this situation with the autistic boy who was forced by Ryanair to take a test despite being exempt from tests. Is this a common occurrence? What's going on around this, do you think?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that struck me about this awful situation. I think the first one, obviously, the child had been provided with an exemption letter by the doctor because obviously they did find it extremely distressing. And what strikes me about this is we're not really showing the compassion that we would expect to see towards children in this particular incident, but also generally in terms of the way society is dealing with children now. And I think how desensitized we've become to allow such a scene of distress to unfold in public, forcing a child to take a test against their will when they've been medically exempted from that, with this sort of singular focus on a very marginal viral risk from that child.
Right.
To cause this level of harm and distress. So I feel we've lost our way and our stability as a society, that we can't hold on to those values of compassion, thinking about a child who is in so much distress. And I think the other thing was the parents had said they told their child about parental authority. They'd said to their child, you won't have to take another test. We've organised this exemption letter for you, and they've broken a promise to their child with no
well, that's the clencher, isn't it? Because for an autistic child, they have to be prepared quite often. They have to know in advance what's coming up, and they'd promised their child that this one test was the only test he'd have to do. And then Ryanair went and broke that parent's promise on their behalf. So the poor kid was shaking, he was crying, he was breaking down. His father filmed it on a video. But I think you're right in that maybe COVID has become the boogeyman. So is this why we're becoming desensitized and we break all of that? We don't care about privacy, compassion, empathy anymore when it comes to COVID, because it's all about COVID. Do you think that's what the reason is?
I think it is. It certainly seems to be that. I think it's we've become very focused on it. But on the other hand, we've also seemed to have dismissed and disregarded the needs of children. We've never explicitly looked at the impact of interventions as they specifically apply to children.
Right.
We've almost treated children throughout as mini adults who are able to absorb the effects of these interventions like social distancing, testing, long-term mask wearing, isolations, being at home. And these are children at a very sensitive time in their development.
Yes.
We don't seem to have thought that actually, this statement that children are resilient seems to be the sort of fallback position to allow us to, as a society, ignore the very real harm that's unfolding. And we're seeing the impact of it now every day. In the newspapers, report after report is showing that, but it almost isn't cutting through somehow that this is real harm, real distress, and we need to do something urgently to think about, if we'd seen that video 2 years ago, how a visceral reaction that most people would have had to that.
We would have gone crazy about it, wouldn't we?
We would, yeah.
But you've listed, obviously, masks, tests, the vaccine. These are all going to be detrimental to a child's mental health if we're forcing them upon them. But also, let's not forget that schools have been closed for the vast majority of the last 18 months, and children have been isolated and or at home with only other adults around. All of this is going to have an impact. Are we seeing the results of that already?
We've seen it. We're seeing it all the time, aren't we? We've seen the attainment gap widening with school closures. We've seen an awful impact on mental health, particularly with teenagers. We've seen a study recently in the US where we've seen an IQ impact on babies that have been born during the pandemic. So from cradle to university, we're seeing an impact on all of our young people. And I don't think we can really know what those consequences are going to be in the short term, but also in the longer term, because you can't press pause on a child's development and on a child's life without expecting there to be negative consequences. And right now, in the situation that we're in, with so over 90% of adults having antibodies, I don't see how we can continue to justify having children, as they are in Scotland, by the way, children living under worse restrictions than adults. So,
well, I'm going to be discussing Scotland in the next hour, but let's focus on the children here for a moment, because we don't actually know if this vaccination is going to be more detrimental to their health than the virus would be. We don't actually know the long-term and medium-term effects of the vaccination on young people. And let's not forget that young people are not as at risk from this virus as older people. So why are we, first of all, offering it to young people? But secondly, why are we forcing it on young people? The second viral video I mentioned was this young girl in America who was physically restrained and injected with the virus against her will. And I understand that she might have been upset because she's afraid of injections in general, but if someone doesn't want to have the vaccine, surely that should be their free choice, whether they're a child or an adult.
Yeah, so I think that maybe just this, I think for me there's two issues here. So I think the first issue is a few weeks ago the JCVI had said they didn't, just to paraphrase, that they didn't think that the potential, albeit small, risks of the vaccination would outweigh the benefits. So in the round, they didn't recommend extending the mass rollout of that vaccine to young people. And then 2 weeks later, they shifted their position. So they're now rolling that out to 16 and 17-year-olds. I must say, I do think the JCVI have been very considered throughout this. But what I would like to ask the JCVI is, what changed in that period? What was that new evidence base on which they've built that? Because one of the benefits that seems to be alluded to, and I think you alluded to this on a show earlier this week, the benefit of undisrupted schooling is really a false transaction, because the disruption to schooling in the context of a protected adult population is a policy choice. So solving that policy choice does not need to be solved by giving a vaccine to children. It needs to be solved by changing that policy, by not mass excluding children from school. So I think looking at what those variables are, why did they make that change? Why did they make that decision? Because it's not so much about, it's about what's the additional risk, but also, as far as I can see, there's no benefit to children, and we don't offer medicine to children without a bit benefit and without making sure that a risk benefit is in place. But the other thing, as you've said, which is incredibly concerning to me, probably more concerning actually, is the coercion aspect of this. Because if I was to think that a vaccine would be offered to children and there would be no coercion in play, I would feel very much more comfortable about that. But that is not what's in play here. We've already seen coercive messaging for the cohort above the 18 to 24s. The Prime Minister even threatened to perhaps remove access to university lecture halls. That's an educational setting which the Prime Minister has indicated, albeit that seems to be off the table for now, that could be restricted. We could restrict access to an educational setting based on the vaccination status. That does not give me any comfort as a parent that coercion will not be put in place in other settings, educational settings at lower age groups. So I think those two issues need to be addressed, and parents would need to feel very comfortable on those 2 points.
Well, that's a good point, because people say, well, nightclubs are a choice. You don't have to go to a nightclub. So if you have to show a vaccine passport to go to a nightclub, that's not coercion. But educational settings are entirely different. To suggest that you need to take a vaccine to go to the university or further education is coercion, because that's saying that young people can no longer have access to their education unless they take the jab. Do you think that we're getting to a point now where we're reaching, the words child abuse because of pinning down and restricting children and forcing them to take a vaccine, and on forcing young people to take a test when they have ADHD and they have an exemption letter from their doctor? Are we reaching that point of child abuse?
I think we are reaching that point, and I think it's because we're adults are turning a blind eye in many cases to the harm that is going on. As a society, adults are supposed to protect children,
yes,
and not the other way around. And I think we've asked, as a collective, we've asked far too much of children now. We've become desensitized to the harm that's going on. And I think it's really time that we step forward and say, no, as adults, we will protect our children. We must stop the harm that's going on right now, because it is still going on. And then we need to make sure that we have a recovery program in place that is properly invested, properly resourced, and is real. It's real. We recognise and we say, we acknowledge the sacrifice that children have made, but I think we seem so far away from that because this harm is still ongoing. We're still doing it to children.
Absolutely. So, Liz Cole, co-founder of Us For Them campaign, a campaign I'm completely behind, supporting the rights of young people, being a voice for children across the nation.